rolling and...
Rolling? You're rolling, good. So would you want me to say something about where I'm from? Which is, my name is Partha Mukhopadhyay. I'm from India. I'm trained as an economist. The training was in India and in the US. And since then I have worked in a variety of positions, some in the private sector, some in the public sector, and now I'm at a research institute which allows me to do only work that I like, and which currently involves looking at issues of service delivery with a special focus on urbanization.
How did you come to apply for the fellowship program in 2005?
How did I come to apply for the fellowship program? Someone sent me an email. I think it was more an email that was sent out relatively generically. I don't think it was a specific email to me, but it was like I think it went out to a mailing list. And that's how I think I got to know about it.
What were your
I mean, I could be
thoughts?
wrong. I think that's roughly right. I mean, the email part is right. What may or may not be right is whether it was a specific email or general emailing. I sort of misremember at this point in time.
And what were your first thoughts? You know, you've probably been to China before, and why would you apply for
Hadn't been to China.
You never been to China?
I had never been to China before that. The closest I had come, as I told these guys, was Taiwan. And what attracted me about that particular thing was that when I was in Taiwan, I visited this National Museum, which I now understand is full of stuff that was taken from China by the KMT when they moved into. So it's a real treasure trove. And they were having this exhibition on the Monkey King, the Journey to the West. And then I realized that the Journey to the West was basically an allegorical account of the visit of this gentleman called Xuanzang, whom I had read about in my history books as a Chinese traveler into India. So that's about as close to China as I had got in a sort of physical sense. But my interest in China had largely been because at that time, which was 2006, early 2006, I had just moved out of my private sector position, which was in investment banking, and started coming into research. And during those 8 years that I spent in investment banking, working with an infrastructure finance firm, I did a lot of work with Indian government officials. And in that time frame, which is the sort of mid-90s to the 2005 or so on, increasingly China began to be looked upon as a comparator. And the issue was, see, with most other countries, whenever you try to do something in India, they say that is too small, there are just a few people, we are different. So it's extremely difficult to bring international experience to India because people think, a lot of policymakers in India think India is unique. With China, obviously, on the size and the stuff, all of that stuff worked, but of course it was a different political system. And so you ask yourself, and it was fairly easy to say, oh, that won't work in India because it works in China because they are a single party, etc. We are a democracy, it doesn't work. And after you hear that a number of times, you ask yourself, let's try and tease out what is it that actually is different because of the political systems, and what is it that can be replicated in either country without too much trouble. So, for example, as I keep saying, is foot overbridges or underpasses in Beijing, which allow people to cross from one side of the road to other, and is not something that, the fact is that Beijing has a lot of them. Delhi has very few of them. Now, if someone tells me that that's because China is an authoritarian state and India is a democracy, I'm not going to respond to that very well, right? So it's that level of story, that you start teasing out what is it that is about China that is important and different, really different. So uh, that question has been there in my mind around that time. And what I found really interesting about the fellowship was the way it was structured. And so I said, no, sounds like an interesting thing to do, let's put it up. Two referees, I called them up. And so I got that application in literally the midnight before it was supposed to arrive. So, yeah, that's broadly how I sort of got into that system.
What about the structure that you just mentioned? That was special for you?
You know, this was the structure where they were going to pick, I mean, that's what we found out, and I think this is one of those nice cases where there was no bait and switch. I mean, what they said they would give, they gave, which is they were going to pick 5 people from India and China. They made it clear that the disciplines were completely open. It was only the urbanization, globalization theme that would be the same. And then they said they were going to let these people figure out for themselves what's going on. And just the ability to interact with 4 other Indian colleagues and 5 Chinese colleagues at close range, intimately, over a period of 2 years, led me to believe that I would learn things about China that I would not learn from a book or a conference or a bunch of other fellowships and so on. Because to help you understand countries, you need friends. And this was one opportunity of building those friendships. So broadly speaking, that's where the first sort of positive reaction one had when one saw the structure of the program. So this makes sense for me. So that's where one sort of came with that story.
And during those 2 years, and now looking back, what were some of the more striking things about, the Partha that was 2 years ago and now Partha now, and what do you think about China, and what other kinds of factors came into play in terms of how you see the fellowship or how you see yourself professionally?
It's sort of at multiple dimensions. I think it's for one, I think it's made me evaluate, and this is something I've come to very recently, it's made me look at Indian democracy very differently. And I'm not now get much more worried about it than I used to be. And it's also helped me reconceptualize the way I saw the linkage between democracy, accountability, and delivery of services. Because when you started off at one level, there's always been this debate in India that our politics is about identities and not about interests. And therefore, when people vote, they're voting either their caste or their religion or things of that sort. They're not voting on the performance of the government. So if the government gives them good clean drinking water, better roads, whatever the story is, it's not essential that they would get re-elected, even if they've done a good job. And this was the hypothesis. This was the sort of, in some sense, conventional wisdom. In order to get re-elected, you had to sort of manage these various identity coalitions appropriately. And therefore, one of the things among us who worked in service delivery felt was perhaps essential is for our politics to become a little bit more interest-based, for people to worry about the quality of public services when they went to vote. And therefore, something I had written around that time had basically said it's important for people to sort of claim the space. And until that thing happens, it's going to be very difficult to generate accountability in public service delivery. I think what's happened over the course of these last 2 years is deepened, has changed that particular initial frame I started working with. And the reason it's changed is as follows, is being in China, you now find that they have a different model of service delivery. And there, in some sense, the government is delivering services of relatively high quality. So there have been real slippages in health and education and a bunch of other services over time. But in a number of other ways, there are relatively high quality levels of services being delivered at different levels of government. Largely as a matter of gaining legitimacy through performance. So, as I say in India, and this is something that, let's say, somebody like Yao Yang was one of my colleagues talk about, and Pratap was a colleague where I work. The issue is the Indian government comes with legitimacy because of its process. There's been an election, people have voted as us, so I am a legitimate government. And in some senses, there is the worry that it rides on that legitimacy to avoid the performance story. The Chinese government does not have that access to legitimacy. So in order to be legitimate, they have to perform, right? And they sort of, as if they're telling the Chinese people, look, you need to be okay with us and you need to let us have control over things because we are good and we do good things to you, right? We've given you roads, stuff, etc., education, growth, all that nice things are happening. Which then brings you back to the original story, which is, do you need politics to have service delivery? If tomorrow somebody says, is that why you think politics is important? Is politics important to get you good water, good education, good sewerage, etc.? If that's the reason what democracy is about, then let me give you a solution. Let me just take away democracy for you. I'll give you all that stuff that you want. Right? And China makes you believe that that's possible. More worrisome is the fact that in certain small pockets of India, under something that's called the Special Economic Zone policy that we have just started, India is, in this particular state, which is the state of Gujarat in India, under a state law, they've designated these particular localities as what they call industrial townships. And that means that the local governments of these localities shall cease to exist. There will be no electoral representation for local governments. And a 3-member committee, which is composed of one person from a private developer, one from the provincial or the state government, and one person from the central government, these 3 people will decide on the various things that the local government used to decide. Right? So in some senses, you already have in India a taking back of that democracy. It's happened at this local level. So suddenly a bunch of people who could vote, they now vote broadly in India, we vote in 3 levels of elections, one for the central government, one for the provincial government, and one for local governments. And the 3rd level election we just have scrapped in this small pockets. These are often Gujarat, maybe 50 square kilometers, in different pockets. Now, so the question therefore is that if that was all there is to democracy, then it may not be necessary for democracy to be there. So it has to be about something more and different. And therefore, that makes me look at identity-based democracies. Democracies in which there will be dissent. And because it's very difficult to dissent over everybody should have good access to drinking water. Right? But you can dissent over whether or not people should have the freedom to criticize each other's religion. And how a society works out those dissents is, I think, a much more important feature of democracy than its ability to improve access to roads, drinking water, etc. Right? And this is possibly a realization that many political scientists have had for a long time. But coming from my discipline, which is essentially a very strong economics base, I've trained as an economist, I've worked more or less in the finance sector and so on. This is a realization that sort of came to me through the fellowship. Right? And therefore now I am much more not just tolerant, but much more interested in understanding what is it that happens with particular interests. What kind of interest-based democracy is there? That to me in some sense is more interesting than the shift from interest-based, what kind of identities, what kind of identity-based democracies are actually there? Over what identities does this contestation take place? Is it the identity over a caste, over religion, over gender, or about something else altogether? About identity about beliefs. I might believe that everybody has the right to free speech, and another person believes that they don't have the right to free speech. And that could be one divide. So it's those things, there's a question therefore in some sense it's more important. It's not something I plan to work on too much because it's not my discipline and field. But to me, it seems much more important to understand how a society evolves mechanisms to address those kinds of dissents than mechanisms which sort of lead them to do these various kinds of other service delivery stories. So that's, I think, in some sense, one of the more fundamental ways in which I've sort of looked at my problem differently. And as I said, what is most worrisome right now is the fact that a number of people who seem to think about democracy on the previous lines, about essentially being a better way to guarantee basic services to people, I think will then get into the problem of what's happening in India. That is it okay, therefore, to take away democratic rights? Can they be substituted with better access? Can I pay you off? Can I buy off your democratic rights by giving you better services? And that argument is now being made in India. It is an argument that the Chinese government has been making to the Chinese people for a long time. That's the frightening part.
Well, it's interesting because last night Yao Yang said the fellowship made me feel better about China and China's progress. And you actually say something slightly different but very similar. In terms of having done this fellowship, I feel better about the kinds of democracy that India has. With of course with reservation.
I think having done this fellowship, I have a better understanding of what the Chinese political process is. But I don't feel better about it. In the sense that I see both China and India going down a path where there seems to be this substitution between representation and services, where in some sense it's okay for people not to be represented as long as they are well fed and well clothed. And I can see why people will think differently and say, no, it's really not important for somebody to have representative rights and democratic rights and so on until they're well fed and well clothed and so on and so forth. But that is something that offends me at a very visceral level. It's not something that's axiomatic to me. It is not something that I am. It's not in some sense that I sort of put into the debate story. And consequently, let me amplify that. Because not only is it something that I don't think is negotiable for me, I also think it is precisely the ability of the Indian democratic system to provide the space for dissent that has helped India stay together over the last 60 years. When India was formed, there were very few people who gave India as a nation, which is extremely multi-ethnic, the chance to stay together. But I think I now more deeply appreciate the manner in which our political processes and our democratic processes have evolved mechanisms that have led to us staying together as a nation. Whereas a lot of this, I remember when I first wrote in the fellowship, it was one of the things that I put down, but now I think I give it much more importance. That the fights in India take place within the ring. So there are the rules of engagement that are defined, and most of the fights is taking place within those rules of engagement. It's like having a boxing match. On the other hand, you can have a street brawl. That's also a fight, but with very different rules of engagement, right? And it's this ability of India to transform street brawls into boxing matches. That is the ability I think China prizes the most. Because what it currently has, whether it's your 90,000 protests against land in various places, whether it's things like Tibet, whether it's various other kinds of protestations that are going on in China, it's worried that most of these protests are taking place outside the agreed upon negotiating space. And what they would like is try to get these things within the ring. And that's partly how I see the Chinese initiative on village democracy, and now a slow increase in the urban democracy, where they're trying to allow representativeness in wards of municipalities kind of stuff, small districts of municipalities kind of stories. I've spoken with Yao on this, and my sense on Yao sees the village democracy much more as a way of getting better accountability and better services. And 2 years ago, I think I would have been much more sympathetic to that view. Today, I see it as one way in which, if that process continues, China would be better able to, if the leaders of China take use the information that's coming out of this democratic process appropriately, you may have a transition to a more representative system in China that's more orderly and managed than one would actually expect. But that said, there is a certain irony about a situation where, as I said, in India, at the local level, democratic rights have been taken away, but at the same time in China they are being actually strengthened. Now it's true that the Indian story, the levels of democratic rights are most probably here and they're sort of slowly dipping down from here. And the Chinese are most probably here and they're slowly moving up from here. But it is the direction of change that worries me. Right? So that's why, let's say, I'm not, because what the lesson that China has taught India in that sense is that it is perhaps in places like Gujarat and so on and so forth, perhaps a democracy is possible to do away with it for that specific purpose. And I think that is throwing away the baby with the bathwater. That's the worry that one has. So that's on one of the major issues. And then there have been a variety of other sort of learnings about China that one has had, where I think, which helps me now that I'm getting more and more involved in research on China. Helps me be much more perceptive, helps me analyze issues much more, helps me engage with my Chinese interlocutors at a much deeper level than I was able to do so 2 years ago. And most of that has come because of relatively deep links and friendships that one has had with my Chinese fellows. And those are not the kind of links you build up in a normal sort of, two people write, I've written papers with a bunch of other people, I don't have those kinds of links with them. So that's the sort of big difference.
So what would be some advice you would give for the cohort 2 fellows at the beginning?
It's something that I talked about this morning with them. It's for the longer term. It's important for them to figure out why they are here. If they are here, this fellowship gives them the opportunity to, I think, do two things. Understand China as a nation, not as a country, as a people, as a culture, much better. And also, I think it helps them, through that prism, understand themselves much better. If they're there with that frame of mind, then I think it's important for them to work towards building relationships and friendships with their Chinese colleagues. To build the kind of relationship where you can sit down and talk about almost anything on earth, which may or may not be offensive. Because between friends you can do that. Between friends you can be frank. Between friends you can look stupid. And if you have that kind of relationship built up with your Chinese colleagues over the next 2 years, you will have a resource. Not only will you have 5 friends which will last you for a lifetime, but you will also, through a variety of links and networks and so on and so forth, build together an understanding of this particular nation that will inform your work for a long time to come. On the other hand, if you just take it as a way of where this fellowship ends in 2 years' time, then I think you will find yourself feeling cheated a few years down the line. Because you will look back and say, I wish I had taken a slightly more longer term view of that particular fellowship. And that doesn't mean this is all about friendships, not about work. But I think the real, if I were to prioritize, if I were to choose, if somebody told me it's going to be all work or all friendships, pick one, I would definitely pick the all friendships first. Because work can happen. Friendships are not that easy to come by. So that's the sort of, if I'm going to speak to the people, that's the basic kind of stuff that you have to go through. The other is, I think, do not focus too much on the other, in the sense that there may be the other thing I learned from this fellowship is that I learned a lot and as much from my co-fellows in India as I did from my fellows in China. Because both of us are large countries with very diverse cultures, neighborhoods, and understandings. And our cohort was lucky. A group of people were lucky that in that we had a diverse group of people. So in India, there was an activist sociologist like Chakra. There was somebody who's been involved in non-governmental organizations, who worked in social work like Amita. There's been Hiren, who's young and dynamic, runs the business operations for Infosys in Beijing. And Aromar, whose primary work is in consulting, but is an extremely deep and thoughtful person, works across a variety of strategic issues, thinks about things that I don't think about. And engaging with these people, I learned a lot about India myself, a lot I learned about myself. There may be a temptation to focus on building, as I said, these friendships with the Chinese, but it's also important to realize that this cohort that comes in, each of them also has 4 Indian, and now under this new dispensation, 5 new school faculty who are also part of this process. And I think it's important to take that approach to these other people also. It's quite surprising what you might learn about yourself, especially about yourself, when you interact with other people from India. And you're willing to open yourself up as opposed to, let's say, doing something which